From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali. It's Monday, October 27, 2014. The latest in the U.S.-led war on Islamic State rebels. We'll hear from Professor Stephen Zunes. Plus, this changes everything, capitalism versus the climate. Acclaimed author Naomi Klein joins us to discuss her latest book. And a big welcome to our viewers on Free Speech TV as we debut the television version of our radio program. We'll bring you more details about that after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Courtney Morris. She's an assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. Hi, Courtney.
Good morning, Sonali.
A New Jersey-based nurse who just returned from West Africa and was forced into isolation because of fears over Ebola has decided to sue her state. Mandatory quarantine periods for those traveling from countries with high incidence of Ebola have been imposed by New York and Illinois in addition to New Jersey. Casey Hickox has not tested positive for Ebola, nor has she shown any symptoms. Her lawyer has labeled her 3-week-long forced isolation as raising, quote, serious constitutional and civil liberties issues. Hickox arrived in New Jersey on Friday from Sierra Leone, where she had been treating Ebola patients. Well, Courtney, what do you make of these quarantines? In addition to potentially violating people's constitutional rights, could they also discourage other medical professionals from volunteering in West Africa where the need is the greatest?
Well, it seems to me that these quarantines are really another effort by Governor Cuomo and Governor Christie to appear that they're doing something really meaningful to address the epidemic, when in fact their efforts would probably be better spent in other things like educating the public about the prevention of transmission of Ebola, supporting the readiness and preparation of hospitals and health workers here in the United States, and supporting those workers who are really those healthcare workers and professionals who are on the front lines fighting the Ebola epidemic. We have the resources and the technology here in the United States to treat this illness. We know this because Nina Pham, the Dallas nurse who was the first person to be infected on U.S. soil, recently tested negative for Ebola. She's recovered fully and is now recuperating from her illness. So we have the resources here to treat the illness. Where we don't have the resources to treat the illness is in West Africa, in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, in Guinea, where now nearly 5,000 people have died. So rather than taking these sort of ad hoc approaches to dealing with the crisis, we really need to take the battle to the front lines, right, where people are experiencing it the most, and putting our efforts there rather than doing making these empty gestures that at the end of the day really don't help us to deal with the crisis at hand.
Another student has died from Friday's school shooting in Marysville, Washington. 14-year-old Gia Soriano died late last night after sustaining injuries from shots fired by her fellow student, Jalen Freiberg. Freiberg opened fire on a number of students in the school cafeteria at Marysville Pilchuck High School, targeting his close friends and cousins. After killing one student, he turned his gun on himself. Soriano became the third fatality from the incident. The 14-year-old Freiberg did not fit the typical loner profile of a school shooter. He was a football player, outgoing and popular, and a member of the prominent family on the Tulalip Indian Reservation. Well, Courtney, what do you make of the school shooting? While the shooter may not fit the typical profile, isn't the common thread with other shootings the actual gun itself?
Well, I suppose no one fits the profile until they kill somebody. These kinds of cases are becoming so common, it's really hard to know what to say that hasn't already been said. We clearly need comprehensive gun policy reform, and there absolutely are ways to do this without infringing on the rights of people, the constitutional right to bear arms. But I suppose that as a nation, the question we really have to ask ourselves is, do we value our guns more than we value each other? and the actions of our leaders seem to suggest that they do. And if we don't agree with them, then we're going to really need to mobilize so that we can prevent these kinds of tragedies from happening again. There's no reason that these three young people in Washington State should be dead and that their families should be missing them. We have the ability to reform gun policy, and to make sure that that young people don't have access to weapons like this and can inflict this kind of harm on one another. So it's a senseless tragedy that is preventable, which makes it that much more tragic.
And finally, voters in Latin America's most populous nation, Brazil, went to the polls over the weekend and narrowly re-elected President Dilma Rousseff. With 51.6% of the vote, Rousseff, according to press reports, struck a conciliatory tone, saying, quote, "I want to be a much better president than I have been until now." Rousseff's tenure and that of her predecessor, Lula da Silva, was marked by corruption scandals, which middle and upper-class Brazilians cited in their disapproval of her. While Brazil's poor overwhelmingly continued to support her and the Workers' Party-led social and economic programs, Rousseff struggled to win votes in wealthier parts of the country. Well, Courtney, would you say that President Rousseff's main lessons from this election are to clean up corruption, but also continue programs benefiting the poor?
Well, certainly, yes. I mean, corruption is definitely an issue that the Rousseff administration is going to have to deal with in this term. But let us be clear. I mean, corruption is not a partisan issue, particularly in Latin American politics, right? We know that Rousseff's opponent, Aécio Neves, who was the former governor of the state of Minas Gerais, during the election period, also came up under accusations of corruption during his tenure as the governor. So this is not something that is really an issue that's limited or confined to one party. It's a structural part of how politics are done in Brazil. So Rousseff's social programs, I think, are definitely her strongest asset in terms of appealing to her base, the poor of Brazil. But she's going to need to continue to make some more meaningful policy changes in this next administration. I think people were very angry about the way that they were treated in the build up to the World Cup. There are still a number of issues to deal with, including the failing economy. Brazil is in recession, issues of citizen security, issues of police abuse, particularly against Black and brown poor Brazilians. So she really has an uphill battle that she's going to have to she's really going to have to rethink her strategy and how she's going to hold on to her base so that the Workers' Party is able to maintain a foothold in Brazilian politics.
Courtney Morris, always a pleasure to have you on. We'll talk to you again next week.
Goodbye, Sonali.
Courtney Morris is an assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. This is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. After many months of preparation and groundwork that involved a crowdfunding campaign, purchasing equipment, and training staff, and doing countless test runs, we're thrilled today to broadcast our first ever program on Free Speech TV. For our viewers on Free Speech TV, we hope you will watch this program daily and make it part of your regular diet of news and analysis. At Uprising, we're proud to be a program that's created by two women of color for a broad audience. We're aware of the dearth of our demographic on both television and radio, and to that end, we don't shy away from tackling issues of race, gender, and class head on, infusing it into our discussions of war, the environment, the economy, and more. Listeners on KPFK and KPFA Pacifica Radio will continue to hear our live radio broadcast every weekday morning. And a few hours later, viewers on Free Speech TV will get to watch that same program on your television screens. Now, Free Speech TV is available on Dish Network, channel 9415, DirecTV, channel 348, and on Roku, which is a great alternative if you don't have or want cable. You can get more at roku.com. This is a very exciting moment for myself and my producer and program director, Bipasha Shom, as well as for KPFK Pacifica, where this program is based and produced, and whose staff have been integral to this project. Later in the hour, we'll thank all of the people who made this program possible. For now, onward with today's program. Now, more than 2 months after the U.S. launched a war against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or ISIS, the Department of Defense announced the first American fatality related to the campaign, although not in combat. 19-year-old Lance Corporal Sean Neal was killed in Baghdad. He was one of thousands of U.S. troops that have been sent to Iraq to train and advise Iraqi forces. The U.S. has also recently overseen the formation of a new Syrian rebel group to counter ISIS in Syria while remaining opposed to President Bashar al-Assad. House Intelligence Committee Chairman Representative Mike Rogers of Michigan said on CBS's Face the Nation yesterday that unless the U.S. sent in ground forces for combat, the war against ISIS would last decades. Meanwhile, a State Department official announced during a trip to the UK that the U.S. was considering bombing oil pipelines under ISIS control in order to stem the financial flow into the hands of the rebel group. The U.S. Treasury Department claims that ISIS is reaping an estimated $1 million a day in illegal oil sales. Now, my guest, Stephen Zunes, is a frequent guest here on Uprising. He's a professor of politics and international studies at the University of San Francisco, where he serves as coordinator of the program in Middle Eastern Studies. Welcome back to Uprising, Stephen.
Good to be with you.
So let's talk about the major defeat that ISIS has had. It's sort of been the first major defeat of the war. It was driven out of the Syria-Turkish border town of Kobani. And many people are trying to interpret that. What do you think that means for the U.S. war? Some commentators worry that losing the battle in Kobani means that ISIS is winning the war elsewhere.
Well, I think what's significant about Kobani was that while U.S. airstrikes may have played something of a role, the credit for the victory against ISIS was by the people themselves. A popular resistance movement led by the Kurdish YPG, with belated enforcements that Turkey allowed in from of Kurds elsewhere. And it was a popular militia which had plenty of motivation. They're the ones who defeated them. Now, this is very different than, say, Iraq, where you have a sectarian government, incredibly corrupt, pretty autocratic, with an army that would not fight. Obviously, you have the brutally repressive regime in Syria. You have this motley assortment of Syrian militias. That some of which are pretty sketchy themselves, and then of course you have the bombing from the United States and its allies, which of course in many ways plays into the hands of ISIS by contributing the narrative that they're protecting the Islamic heartland from the Western infidels or whatever. But I think really that the lesson from Kobani is that if ISIS is going to be defeated, it has to be defeated on the ground by the people. Who have motivation and have a leadership and structure that they trust.
Now, Stephen, the New York Times yesterday published an article entitled "Missiles of ISIS May Pose Peril for Air Crews," and in it they described how ISIS seems to have or may have the capability of surface-to-air missile systems. They've even boasted about being able to possibly shoot down Apache helicopters belonging to the U.S. Now, if this is true, and there have been many allegations of ISIS capturing U.S. weapons, what does it mean, not just for the war, but also for how ISIS is getting access to all of this weaponry?
Well, most of their weapons is actually of U.S. origin. The United States has never armed ISIS directly, but they have captured U.S. weapons from rebel groups the United States had, or some of its Gulf allies that also receive U.S. weapons. They've captured from these other rebel groups. Their big largesse, of course, came from their seizure of much of northwestern Iraq from the Iraqi armed forces, which basically just left their fancy U.S. equipment behind for ISIS to gobble up. And it would not be at all surprising if they have surface-to-air missiles that are capable of not just shooting down helicopters, but even a larger aircraft at higher altitudes as well. And it's yet another reminder of that this insane arms race the United States has been fueling in the Middle East for years has once again come back to haunt us, and how this idea of sending more arms to more dubious allies, which may end up again being taken over by ISIS forces, raises serious questions about further militarizing the region really makes sense.
Now, ISIS is supposedly the best armed rebel jihadi group in history. I mean, this is a claim that we've been hearing, and I'm wondering what you make of this announced strategy that the U.S. may take up, which is to bomb oil pipelines under ISIS controls. They're apparently making $1 million a day from this sort of revenue.
That figure sounds a little bit high to me, but I think that that is certainly one source of income. I think, and most of what the oil that they sell does not come from pipelines. It comes from directly from areas from refineries that they control, and trucks and other vehicles they're able to smuggle across the Turkish border. I mean, frankly, if there was real seriousness in stopping the oil flow, it would be to support the Turkish government and push them to crack down on the smuggling operations, to crack down on corrupt officials that are making this possible, and do that kind of legwork. It's like a lot of things here. There are a number of non-military options that are available, but when it comes from Washington's perspective, it almost seems that we go to the military options first, even if they may not be the most effective.
Let's talk about the U.S.'s efforts specifically in Syria. Late last week, the Washington Post reported that in terms of the newly cobbled together Syrian rebel group, the U.S., rather than train them to fight ISIS, is going to train them simply to hold their ground. Quote, officials do not believe the newly assembled units will be capable of capturing key towns from militants without the help of forward deployed U.S. combat teams, which President Obama has so far ruled out. Are you confused about the U.S.'s policy of this new rebel group that they've just essentially put together, a piece here, a piece there in Syria?
Well, I think they're just being realistic. I mean, they realize that that is not large enough or strong enough to be able to seriously take on ISIS. I think the only real hope of defeating ISIS is if it comes from areas that are immediately within their control, because again, they're not just suppressing religious and ethnic minorities, but they're oppressing Sunni Arabs under their control as well. I mean, the way that ISIS's predecessor, Al Qaeda in Iraq, was defeated was not because of the surge, as the Republicans claim, but because of the Sunni awakening. And the tribal leaders within that territory themselves realized that they were a bigger threat than the Iraqi government of the United States, and they organized and mobilized their people to rise up against AQM. So a similar a similar movement needs to emerge, but that's not the kind of thing that the United States or any other power can kind of cobble together. And so I think just the limits that Obama has had on arming the rebels now, and indeed since the Syrian civil war broke out, I think is a reflection of both his awareness and presumably those of the generals and other people advising him that they really it's really difficult to put together a cohesive fighting force in the ridiculously factionalized mess that is Syria.
Well, Stephen Zunes, it's always a pleasure to have you on. We appreciate your analysis. We'll talk to you, I'm sure, another time soon. Thanks so much.
Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Stephen Zunes is our guest. He is a professor of politics and international relations at the University of San Francisco, where he also serves as coordinator of the program in Middle East Studies. When we come back, we'll speak with Naomi Klein. Stay tuned.
Yeah, this song is called Time to Go.
Everyone has an opinion. Somewhere there's
This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. A major climate conference in Copenhagen opens today, bringing together delegates from more than 100 countries with climate scientists. This ahead of a United Nations summit in Paris next year. They're tasked with editing a major report, a draft of which was leaked to the press, and apparently states that climate change could have, quote, serious, pervasive, and irreversible impacts on human civilization. The news comes just days after the European Union agreed late last week to cut its emissions by 40% from 1990 levels by the year 2030. Despite the strength of such an action, it may still not come soon enough or be drastic enough. A new study published in Nature Geoscience yesterday confirms what countless others have shown, that climate change will be utterly devastating. Specifically, based on the results of a computer simulation, the study predicts that communities in Europe and Asia will be twice as likely to have colder and harsher winters than they do now. 97% of active climate scientists know that our planet is warming and that we caused it through our over-reliance on fossil fuels. What scientists also know is that unless we take radical steps now to curb our emissions, we are hurtling toward a dystopian future. Author Naomi Klein wants to shape that future in a way that gives us the best shot at surviving in a warming climate and finding justice and equity along the way. She lays out her plan in a new book called This Changes Everything: Capitalism versus the Climate. If the vast influence of her earlier book, The Shock Doctrine, is any indication, then the book by Naomi Klein does indeed change everything. It puts the onus of climate change squarely on the shoulders of our global capitalist system and makes the most compelling case to date for why the issue of climate change is to be squarely on the shoulders of capitalism. Naomi Klein is an award-winning journalist and author of the critically acclaimed #1 international bestseller, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, and No Logo, Taking Aim at the Brand Bullies. She's a contributing author and editor for Harper's Magazine, a reporter for Rolling Stone, and a syndicated columnist for The Nation and The Guardian. She's also a member of the board of directors of 350.org and a Puffin Foundation writing fellow at the Nation Institute. I spoke with Naomi Klein recently about her book. Welcome to Uprising, Naomi Klein.
Thank you.
Now, before we get into the sort of dire need to address climate change, which we'll just take for granted, let's discuss the fact that even today, when study after study is proving, beyond reasonable doubt how serious the issue is, even when 97% of active climate scientists agree that we're in trouble, there's still a very vocal, very well-funded sector of society that denies the planet is warming. And we've kind of come to accept that that's how it's going to be, but there is a reason for their denial that's actually based on something pretty fundamental that you touch on in your book, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I spend a little time in the book looking at the climate change denier movement. It's just one chapter, and that movement is a product of the right-wing think tank complex. It's really important to understand that this is not like a wing of the scientific community that broke off organically to say, no, the science is wrong. It's a creation of the think tank complex. And, the vast majority of the books are published by think tanks like the American Enterprise Institute, the Cato Institute, the Heartland Institute, which is, of course, the ground zero of climate change denial. And this is not a scientific organization. This is a free market think tank, or so-called free market think tank. And the reason they deny climate change is because these are policy organizations. These are lobby groups, whatever you want to call them. The think tanks exist to push a very particular worldview that we're all familiar with. It's privatization, deregulation, cuts to social spending, free trade, just the panoply of neoliberal policies. And what they understand, it's the argument I make, is that if climate change is real, if those 97% of climate scientists are telling the truth, then essentially their whole ideological project collapses. Because obviously greed is not just good, as they've been telling us for so long. It is not the best route to achieve the best possible outcomes for the most number of people. It's destabilizing our planet's life support systems. That's a pretty big downside of deregulated capitalism. But also, if this is true, and obviously it is true, then it calls for a forceful government response. You have to regulate, you have to get in the way of fossil fuel companies and tell them, no, you can't dig up, about 80% of the carbon they have already counted in their reserves. You have to invest in the public sphere, something else they don't much like, to get us off fossil fuels and also to protect ourselves from the storms that are already coming. So you see really clearly why they deny climate change, because it profoundly threatens their worldview.
So not only is the blame for the climate crisis at the root of our capitalist system, but the solution lies in dismantling. You make that case, dismantling the system that they're so heavily invested in, both financially and emotionally and morally, and that's pretty hard to face.
Yeah, and I think specifically this brand of deregulated capitalism that really sees no role for the state could never respond to a crisis like climate change, because it's the ultimate collective crisis. It also requires a justice-based response. It requires some redistribution, and this has been true since the very beginning. The climate treaty that was signed in 1992 by almost every government in the world, including the United States, says clearly that the responses to climate change have to be based on common but differentiated responsibility, which is recognizing that there are countries that have a 200-year head start on emitting carbon and have, since the Industrial Revolution, been contributing to this crisis. So the responses have to reflect that. So there's going to be a redistributive quality to it. And that's the other challenge to this sort of brutal right-wing worldview. The irony is, because this denial movement has been so successful in spreading doubt and preventing action for so long, now the actions that we have to take are so dramatic. We've allowed emissions to rise so much that we now need to cut emissions so dramatically that they actually don't just challenge neoliberalism and sort of market fundamentalism, but actually challenge the fundamental logic of a growth-based free market economy, which because the level of cuts we need to make are between 8 to 10% a year, and that's really not compatible with the kind of economic growth that we have.
Right. And you point out in your book something that's really interesting that I hadn't really heard before or thought about before, which is that the window of opportunity that there existed for us to make cuts that might not have threatened the very basis of capitalism passed because of the expansion, the rapid expansion around the implementation of NAFTA, to a level that was so dizzying that now it's all or nothing.
Yeah, I mean, this is the strange sort of parallel process that's been going on in the international sphere, where we've got all these negotiators who've been supposedly negotiating towards a climate treaty, failing
at the UN,
at the UN.
Yeah.
But then you have this parallel process, which is the trade negotiations that have been going on, and that's been enormously successful and just moved from sort of triumph to triumph, although there have been a few setbacks. But as we know, the so-called global economy has expanded dramatically in this same time period, and on a model that took no account of the climate crisis, right? You could have designed trade rules in this period, because the rules were being designed in the same period where we were dealing with the climate crisis. The World Trade Organization was created in the early 1990s, right? So this was already when climate change was very much on the public agenda, and yet the way the trade rules were designed took no account of the need to lower emissions. So there were no penalties on particularly high carbon models of development. And so if you're a multinational corporation and your only goal is to lower costs, which has been the goal of our trading system from the beginning, then you're not just going to scour the globe looking for the cheapest labor, and we know that that is what these multinationals have been doing. You're just going to look for the cheapest costs overall, and that is intimately associated with coal.
Right.
So there has been an emissions explosion that is absolutely tied to the offshoring of labor and the driving down of costs. That is the hallmark of the so-called globalization era.
So it's not just the multinationals that are guilty. I mean, we are all, whether we critique capitalism or not, whether we like capitalism or not, part of this system. I mean, we've, even on the left, gotten used to being able to buy one-click items off of Amazon and have them arrive at our doorstep the next day. In many ways, we are all part of the problem, and this is also something that is hard to face.
Yeah, I think that this is one of the things that makes climate change uniquely difficult to deal with is that you can't just point the finger at others. You are part of that system. But I think that that's always the case when we're critiquing a dominant model that we all exist within. I mean, you think about the WTO protest, and it's just like, well, you can't be against the WTO. You're wearing Nikes, and this gotcha game that is very much so much a part of, in a way, I think how we feed political paralysis, where we set this absurd standard that you need to be completely outside of a system in order to critique it. But we have these all-encompassing systems that don't give people good choices, right? I mean, when you go fill up your car with gasoline, you aren't voting for Exxon. You aren't saying, I love Exxon. I mean, most people hate filling up their cars. It's like one of the worst parts of daily life, But they don't have the option. They don't have good public transit. They don't have charging stations that are convenient. They don't have good alternate transit infrastructure. But we act as if that makes an individual equally culpable to Exxon, So I think, first of all, we need to say that there are levels of complicity where just because we're within the system doesn't mean we're giving it our vote, we're giving it our consent. But also I think we've fed this, some progressives have, by making this all about sort of lifestyle decisions and sort of, making it about, what do you wear, what do you eat, what do you do? And I think it is important to the extent that we can to bring our actions in line with our values. But if we send the message that you're somehow illegitimate in participating in this discussion because you use fossil fuels, because you're working within a capitalist system, well, that's a really great way to have a very small movement, because there'll be like 4 of you.
Right, right. So what's really interesting also is at the time that we're seeing our planet warming, at the time when people are feeling paralyzed against this array of vocal deniers that have paralyzed our political process in Congress here in the U.S., we're also seeing very wealthy people prepare for a dystopian climate future with, insurance companies, as you point out in your book, with these fancy premium plans for the rich to survive the climate crisis. So many companies are taking account of the fact that they will be doing business in the future on a warming planet. Some are even counting on a warming planet being better for them than it is for other parts of the world. This is evil. I mean, it's evil.
It is evil. But for me, that's the least surprising part of this story. Like, this is what our system is built to do. We can count on that. If we do nothing, it's not just that the world gets hotter. It's that it gets hotter and way more brutal, because that's what happens in the face of every crisis. This is what my last book was about.
Right.
This is
the shock doctrine.
Yeah, I mean, and in many ways, I see this book as a response to the shock doctrine, in the sense that, that book ends and begins with Hurricane Katrina, which is a glimpse at that dystopic future. And I always felt like when I was covering these disaster zones, where you had this highly stratified winners and losers, like the green zone, red zone in Iraq, and this sort of privatized enclaves in disaster zones, and private security, and they become and the whole sort of disaster capitalism complex descending and finding ways to profit from the wreckage. That I was seeing glimpses of the future that we would create in this shock-driven world that we're creating through both economic shocks and climate shocks. So that's the road we're on. All we have to do to just intensify that is nothing. Those are the values that govern our society right now. We know we're fortressing our borders. We know that we are willing to write off huge sectors of humanity, because we're doing it. I mean, that's what it means, actually, to knowingly allow temperatures to increase to 2 degrees, let alone 4 to 6 degrees, which is where we're headed. But our governments decided to set that target of 2 degrees Celsius warming in Copenhagen, knowing that that would be a death sentence for large parts of sub-Saharan Africa, for island states that would still see sea level rise, that they would be unable to cope with. So this is a brutal system.
Right.
And that is why it is so important, not just to be talking about little gentle market mechanisms here and there. We need a shift in values if we're going to respond to climate change in a way that is not utterly barbaric.
And I want to get to that, but going back to this moment in time when we did have an opportunity to close the emissions issue, where we had the opportunity to ratchet down climate change, that we lost at one part of the story is also how green groups colluded with business. I mean, even after couple of decades where the U.S. saw great victories in passing things like the Clean Water Act, green groups went from being confrontational to corporations. Many of them started to slowly work with corporations and enable them to greenwash themselves. How severe a problem is that to our environmental movement today?
Well, I think it's been quite a severe problem and a big part of why we haven't had real solutions on the table. And, you know, I struggled with how much of this to include in the book because, you know, I think that most of the blame does not rest with the environmental movement. I think most of it, you know, rests with the fossil fuel companies and their friends in governments and their lobbying arms and so on. But that said, I think, you know, what I argue in the book is that climate change has had spectacularly poor historical timing because it really landed on our laps at the end of the 1980s. And in this period, environmental groups were having this identity crisis because during the Reagan years, there was this attack on environmentalism because there was a backlash against everything that represented so-called command and control regulation, right? So you had groups like the Environmental Defense Fund that were inspired by Rachel Carson's writing, that their first campaigns were about banning DDT, and they were about top-down regulation. They were like, this is harming people. We need to get rid of it. We need to highly regulate it. And so what happened is that as the red menace began to recede in the 1980s, environmentalism became the new boogeyman for the right. And it was like, there was this whole thing of like, you're a watermelon, you're green on the outside and red on the inside. And so a lot of these green groups had really gotten used to access to power. They were not really outsider groups. They were lawyers and lobbyists. And when the Reagan administration turned on environmentalists, these groups really faced a choice. Like, are we going to forsake this access, forsake this insider status, and become outsiders? Because that's essentially the message that your way of affecting change that was so successful in the 60s and 70s with the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, that is now basically communism in the new world order. So do you defend those principles? Or do you change and get with the time? And a lot of groups changed. And that was the era when they started making partnerships with McDonald's and Walmart and talking about win-win solutions and how it was actually going to be good for business and so on. And I think that, you know, there are ways in which certain environmentally friendly actions are good for business. You know, it is good for companies to be more energy efficient. It'll save them money. But when you're dealing with something like climate change, it's much too big for these types of gentle solutions. And, you know, Walmart is a good example because this is a brutally growth-based, profit-driven company, as we all know, right? So Walmart has become more energy efficient because that does lower its costs.
Right.
But at the same time, its expansion and land use and other activities lead its emissions to continue to rise steadily. So, you know, it gets celebrated by a lot of these green groups as an environmental leader because its energy intensity is going down. But of course, its actual use of energy, its real use of energy is going up. For the same reason, all of our use of energy is going up because we're locked within this growth-based model.
Right. So that's a perfect segue into Margaret Thatcher's "There is no alternative" line. And this is something that I think many sectors of society have internalized that somehow if we are to get ourselves out of this mess, it has to be in line with capitalism, because that's just the dominant global economic model. There is no alternative. But you say that's not true, that in fact you see climate change and this catastrophe that's coming as actually an opportunity for us to remake a more equitable system. And that's pretty remarkable. To me, that's sort of a game-changing way of looking at it. Can you explain how such a huge transition, because it does seem daunting, could even be possible?
Well, I think for the same reasons that the right is so threatened by climate change, that these market fundamentalists are afraid of the science, progressives should not be afraid of the science and look at it, precisely because it provides such a strong argument for many of the kinds of policies that we've been fighting for so many years. It does provide such a strong argument for not just any kind of public investment, but a justice-based public investment. If you invest massively in public transit, it's going to help low-income people the most, because that's who use transit. If you accompany that with progressive housing policy, and you actually make sure that the people who use transit are able to afford housing next to transit, which is the way to make it most effective, then it's also going to have a redistribution effect. And if you have a polluter pays framework for your regulations, then you're going to be able to get the resources you need to pay for it. So, and you also have this really strong argument against free trade deals that are standing in the way of so many important policies. And I go into this in depth in the book about how free trade is now being used as a weapon against some of the most important climate policies that governments are trying to pass. So, I don't see any of this as inevitable, as we've been talking about. I mean, there are many unjust ways of responding to this crisis, and we can take for granted that is how our current system
Right,
will.
If we do nothing.
Yeah, but here's where what actually gives me hope. I said that this crisis landed on our lap at the worst possible moment in the 1980s. But its do or die moment comes to us at a very different juncture, where I think there is a profound desire for economic change in this country and around the world. There is a deep dissatisfaction with the gaping inequality that has been left by precisely the policies that have been blocking our action on climate change. So if the pre-existing desire to have a more just economy and to address deep racial and economic injustice is the framework in which we deal with climate change, which is often called a climate justice response, then we have a way to bring together all of these different movements. And I think that is not just sort of utopian or pie in the sky. It's the only hope we have of taking on the vested interests that have been preventing action, is to have a vision for climate response that provides enough very concrete advantages in terms of jobs, in terms of services, in terms of a more hopeful present to large constituencies, that they would be willing to fight for it. Because this is always the problem with climate change, is that because it has generally been pitched to a white middle class constituency, it's this issue that everybody cares about, but not that much. So it doesn't have urgency behind it. It's like even the people who do say they care about it rank it 20th among other issues that they care about. So the way we respond to climate change can't pit jobs versus the environment, health versus the environment, community, services, education. It has to be a package that is the framework for how we win on all of these other fronts.
So this is, in terms of how that is implemented, it sounds like we are also going to need a great amount of government intervention. You have a quote in your book: "The only green company is one that is forced by law to be green," or something to that effect. Right, and so that then also, of course, raises the specter of big government to an extent that even though some parts of the left fear. We have examples of left governments that have been just as extractive. The Soviet Union comes to mind, even Latin American left-leaning countries like Bolivia and Brazil, which have tried to have more equitable societies, financially speaking, have not necessarily had that go hand in hand with staving off climate crisis. So this has to be a project that is very carefully designed and can't just be, let's have all of the things on our progressive wish list.
Yeah, I think this is really a transition to something we have never tried before. And I think that's the sort of risk of calling this, making the subtitle "Capitalism versus the Climate," is that then the implication is that this is calling for a return to state socialism, and as you point out, that was just as bad for the planet. In fact, one of the only times our emissions have dropped precipitously is when the Soviet Union collapsed and those economies went into free fall because and carbon emissions went down. So that's not the solution. But one of the things that we can see is that it is possible to design bold national policies that systematically decentralize power and create a lot of smaller alternatives rather than these sort of big centralized state solutions that have a historically bad record of both accountability to people and bad environmental records. And I think the German experience is a good example of that. The German feed-in tariff program, which set very ambitious targets for emission reduction and for transition to renewable energy, but at the same time created incentives for a lot of small players to become energy providers and encourage, there are 900 new energy cooperatives. There are all of these cities and towns that have voted to take back control over their power grids, but not just to sort of hand them over to a state agency, but to run them more democratically with more accountability. So, it's an example of the sort of real win-wins, because these do have the real promise of bringing emissions down quickly if it's accompanied with forceful regulation of the coal industry, which Merkel hasn't done. And it also is bringing resources to communities that need resources, because rather than having the profits from energy production hemorrhage into the pockets of outside shareholders, they're staying in the community. It's helping to pay for services. So, at a time when Europe is racked by austerity policies, this is really important. If you can provide real climate energy solutions that also address austerity, you're going to get people's attention, and that's starting to happen.
One of the things you talk about in your book that's also quite optimistic is how the front lines of today's climate justice fights have been in Indigenous communities. Your Canadian, the First Nations groups in Canada have been at the forefront of fighting the Alberta tar sands. Here in the United States, we see that as well. And you also talk about this interesting phenomenon, blockadia, interlinked pockets of resistance to what is our extractive economy. Is this the way of, or the most hopeful sense of a future that we could imagine, looking at these groups?
Well, I think that what these groups are showing us is is a framework for the kind of laws we need in place, which is really a legal framework that closes down the new carbon frontiers, right? And we have the opposite. We have governments that are at the very moment that we should be getting off fossil fuels and we should be building the infrastructure for the next economy. They're doubling down on the dirtiest, highest emission fossil fuels and locking us in with vast new infrastructure projects. And this is why it's so significant that there is this grassroots movement. I use this term blockadia that comes out of the fight against the Keystone XL pipeline, that are trying to block these infrastructure projects using a range of tools, from direct action to Indigenous legal challenges, using Aboriginal title to fight these infrastructure projects. And it's important to understand that these are multi-billion-dollar pieces of infrastructure, whether we're talking about LNG export terminals or coal export terminals or tar sands pipelines or new tar sands mines to feed those pipelines. These are pieces of infrastructure that are built to last for around 40 years, and that's impossible on the science-based timeline that we are on. But I'm not positing blockadia as a substitute for regulation. I think that this is the grassroots stepping into the leadership vacuum and doing so to protect their land. But what started off as pockets of local resistance that were mostly only about protecting the local, are now see themselves as part of a global movement to stop climate change. And you saw that really clearly during the People's Climate March in New York, where all of these pockets of the people fighting fracking in New York, the people fighting tar sands, the people fighting, mountaintop removal, all came together and articulated this principle of, when you're in a hole, the first thing you should do is stop digging.
Right. I want to end on a personal note. Naomi Klein, you start your book, but also end it on the fact that you've become a mother recently, and your having a child forced you to face the reality of climate change. And I think a lot of new parents have that similar experience. I certainly did. And you also write about your struggles with infertility in a very candid way, also things that I can personally relate to, in a way in which drawing the parallels between how our own bodies, women's bodies, deal with or struggle with infertility, to how all our species on the planet today are struggling, and our planet is struggling to create and to sustain life because of all of this toxicity that we are just generating. Why was that important for you to put it into that perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I struggled a lot with whether or not to include this in the book, but this, in the end, I included it just sort of in the spirit of transparency, because it took me 5 years to write the book, and this is what was going on in my personal life during those 5 years.
I don't think anyone would have wondered necessarily.
But in the spirit of transparency, in the sense that it shaped the way I saw climate change, and it shaped the patterns that I identified, and I think that it was valuable for me on a personal level to hit a biological boundary, to sort of feel that sort of hitting a wall, and also encounter this this medical world, that what I call the fertility factory, whose response to hitting that wall is just like, let's throw as much like chemical and technological intervention as possible and not ask why this is happening. Because I would go from there to conferences on geoengineering, which I couldn't help but see parallels where we treat our bodies like machines. We treat the earth like machines. We don't believe that it's possible to hit the wall because there are so much resiliency built into. So we don't. It's almost like that. It's a trick, because our bodies are so resilient, because we do bend. We don't believe that we actually can break, right? But we can break. We can hit that wall, and the same is true for our natural systems. We can push too far, and so for me, I've always found that I always have talked about the reason why I don't just write from home. The reason why I go places and report is because I think there's a difference between, just knowing something in your head and knowing something in your body. I've always felt that, and for me, this experience with infertility and these fertility treatments was the way in which I got that kind of body knowledge about natural boundaries. So I wanted to weave that in, because I also just think it helps to draw these personal connections for people, because the crisis is so big. So ways that we can make it small and tangible help, and it starts interesting discussions, and people share their own experiences too, and we sort of develop a language for talking about something that's hard to talk about.
Well, Naomi Klein, here's to the survival of our planet for the sake of all our children. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I've been speaking with Naomi Klein, acclaimed author, about her brand new book, This Changes Everything: Capitalism versus the Climate. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali. We come now to the end of our very first program on Free Speech TV. Our listeners on KPFK and KPFA Pacifica Radio will continue to hear our live radio broadcast every weekday, and a few hours later, viewers on Free Speech TV will get to watch that same program on your television screens. Free Speech TV is available on Dish Network Channel 9415, DirecTV Channel 348, and on Roku. This exciting transition would not have been possible without the crucial help of the following individuals. In alphabetical order, Jonathan Alexander, KPFK's IT specialist who worked many long hours, including weekends, solving our technical problems, fixing equipment, troubleshooting, and creating the technical architecture that we needed to pull this off. Jonathan has been one of our greatest cheerleaders. Tony Aratia, who told me years ago that I should be on television and that he would help to make it happen, and indeed he did. Tony moved mountains to get us what we needed, and for that we are truly grateful to him and to Keycode Media. Brett Collins at BC Live Productions, who's been deeply committed to this project from the start, done more than he needed to, showed us the utmost patience and professionalism, and done so much for so little, helping us set up our studios, designing our set, and much, much more. Bob Conger, KPFK's chief engineer, who patiently redesigned many aspects of the room that we're broadcasting from, turning our studio, designed for radio, into one that can accommodate both TV and radio, which is no easy feat. Zuberry Fields, KPFK's interim general manager, who started his staunch support for this project while he was operations manager and continued to provide all the support that we needed, even as he juggled multiple priorities, from overseeing contracts to purchasing equipment. Alan Minsky, KPFK's interim program director, has supported us every step of the way and championed this transition with such optimism, even when we were worried we couldn't pull it off. Jesse Wood, KPFK volunteer and outreach coordinator, who worked hard to make the Uprising TV launch party a success. Bipasha Shom, Uprising's producer and program director, who I want to personally express gratitude for. She's been the backbone of this project, showing the utmost dedication, working long, long hours, doing everything she can, learning new skills on the fly, and of course putting up with me. And without her, it has now become quite clear there really would be no Uprising. I also want to thank the incredible folks at Free Speech TV. Jason McCain, with whom I first began conversations a year and a half ago and who has been such a wonderful champion of Uprising. Benjamin Gass, whose creative support during fundraising was crucial. Than Reeder, whose technical consultations were so very helpful. Antoinette June, who helped tremendously with our social media promotions, as well as Ron Williams, Alexander Maness, Heather Schreck, and all the good folks at FSTV, with whom we hope to have a long and fruitful collaboration. Now, I also want to thank those people outside KPFK who volunteered their time and energy to this project. Ayapa Bidanda and members of the incredible band Ozo Motley, who helped us in our fundraising efforts and whose music we're using in our music break. Amy Goodman and Chris Hedges, who went out of their way to record fund pitches for our campaign and lend their names to this project. Chris Manley, who along with TK Shom shot much of the original footage that went into our title sequence. Chris also provided many hours of lighting consultation. Tagori Mazzoni, a loyal listener of Uprising who spent many hours volunteering his time and helped put together Uprising's television title sequence, patiently working to incorporate our input. And also thanks to Vanessa Marzaroli, who provided her important feedback. Members of the Grammy Award-winning band Quetzal, who have been longtime listeners and supporters and who volunteered to create our original theme music simply for the love of KPFK and Uprising. Andrew Thomas and the staff of the Bond Agency, who designed our new logo online at wearebond.com. And of course, I want to especially thank the listeners of KPFK and KPFA who donated to our crowdfunding campaign to raise the more than $60,000 we needed in just 30 days to make them happen. Among them, our family and friends and colleagues and lots of our friends and the entire Uprising team. We deeply, deeply are grateful to you, and we've listed your names on our website at uprisingradio.org. Bipasha Shom is our producer and program director. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Federico Garcia and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. Our interns are Camilo Ramirez and Christian Beck. Our theme music is by Quetzal. Again, our website is uprisingradio.org. I'm your host and executive producer of Uprising, Sonali Kulhatkar. I'll see you tomorrow.